A young woman's life is turned upside down when her husband falls into a coma after a workplace accident. While doctors say all hope is lost, their 8-year-old daughter refuses to give up, becoming the only bridge between her father and the world. What begins as a simple act of a child's love ends up defying modern medicine and rekindling an entire family's faith. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and let us know what city you're watching from. Let's continue. I promise this will be the best story you'll ever hear. The sun hadn't fully risen when Megan's phone rang. It was a typical Tuesday in March, the kind where Denver wakes up with a light haze over the mountains and traffic is already starting to build on the main avenues. Megan was making breakfast while Julia finished tying her sneakers for school. The routine was always the same. Ryan left before 6 in the morning for the construction site in the south end of the city. She would drop their daughter off at school and then head to her job at the local grocery store. A simple life, built with a lot of hard work, full of plans and dreams, tucked away in a blue notebook kept in a kitchen drawer. When the phone buzzed on the table, Megan found it strange. Ryan never called this early. Maybe he'd forgotten something. His lunchbox, probably. She answered with a smile, ready to tease him about being so forgetful. On the other end of the line, a tense, unfamiliar voice cut through any chance of lightheartedness. It was Mark, Ryan's co-worker. The words came out jumbled, confused, heavy with urgency. Accident, electric shock, hospital, ambulance. Megan couldn't process it all at once. She felt her legs go weak, the kitchen spinning around her. Julia, who was playing with her pencil case at the table, stopped and looked at her mother with the kind of intuition only children have when something is terribly wrong. Megan dropped everything. She called her mum, Celia, asked her to pick Julia up from school later, and ran out the door. University Hospital was far, but she didn't even think about that. She caught the first bus that came by, her thoughts a chaotic mess, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst from her chest. Ryan, her Ryan, the man who slept with his arm around her every night, who played horsey with Julia on the weekends, who dreamed of owning a house with a backyard. What had happened? When she arrived at the ER, she found Mark at the entrance, pale, his hands still dirty with dust from the site. He tried to explain they were installing electrical wiring on the 10th floor of a building under construction. Ryan, always so careful, always following safety regulations, had gone up to check the distribution box. No one knows exactly how it happened. Maybe a frayed wire, maybe a faulty circuit breaker. The fact is there was a short circuit. Ryan took an electrical charge so powerful it threw him backward. He fell. His co-workers ran to him. When they got there, he wasn't breathing. His heart had stopped. They performed CPR right there on the floor of the construction site, with trembling hands and desperation taking over. Someone called 911. The ambulance took almost 15 minutes to arrive. 15 eternal minutes. When the paramedics finally managed to revive Ryan, nearly 2 minutes had passed without a heartbeat. 2 minutes might not seem like much, but for the human brain it can mean an eternity of irreversible damage. Megan listened to all of this in silence, leaning against the hallway wall, tears streaming down her face uncontrollably. Mark tried to comfort her, but there were no words. She could only repeat in her head, "He's alive, he's alive, he's alive." It was the only thought keeping her from completely falling apart. It took hours before a doctor finally came out to speak with her. He was a young man in a crisp white lab coat with dark circles under his eyes that betrayed a long shift. He introduced himself as Dr. Evans, an ICU doctor. Megan shot up, her legs barely supporting her own weight. The doctor was direct. Ryan was alive, but in critical condition. The electrical shock had caused a prolonged cardiac arrest. Even with resuscitation, his brain had been deprived of oxygen long enough to cause severe neurological damage. He was in a deep coma, intubated, dependent on machines to breathe. The next few days would be crucial, but the doctor couldn't make any promises. In fact, his tone made it clear the chances were slim. Megan wanted to scream, to shake that doctor, and demand he do something, anything, but she just nodded, accepting the words like punches to the gut. She asked to see him. The doctor hesitated, but finally agreed. 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes. When she entered the ICU, Megan barely recognized the man in that bed. Ryan, always so full of life, always smiling, was motionless, connected to a terrifying number of tubes and wires. His face was swollen, his skin pale, his eyes closed. The only sounds were the constant beeping of the heart monitor and the rhythmic hiss of the ventilator. Megan held his hand, feeling the warmth that still radiated from the body she knew so well. She leaned in and whispered in his ear, "I'm here, honey. You're going to be okay. We need you. Julia needs you." But Ryan didn't move, not a twitch, not a sign, just his body, there and not there at the same time. The following days were a blur of pain, fear and exhaustion. Megan practically lived at the hospital. Celia took over caring for Julia, picking her up from school, making meals, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy. But Julia knew something was very wrong. She asked about her dad all the time. At first, Megan tried to shield her, saying her dad was in the hospital and would be home soon. But children can sense things. Julia saw the desperation in her mother's eyes, heard the whispered conversations between her grandmother and her uncles, and she started to become quiet, withdrawn, with a look in her eyes that was no longer a child's. In the second week, the medical team held a meeting with Megan. Dr. Evans was there, along with the head neurologist, Dr. Wallace, a middle-aged woman with a gaze that was both firm and compassionate. She showed them the scans, the images of Ryan's brain. She explained with painful calm and clarity that the damage was extensive. The areas responsible for consciousness had been severely affected. Ryan was in a vegetative state. There was no significant brain activity, no response to stimuli. There was, in their assessment, no real possibility of recovery. Megan heard all of this and felt her world collapse for the second time. Dr. Wallace brought up the subject Megan had been dreading, the possibility of taking him off life support. It wasn't a decision that had to be made immediately, but it was something that needed to be considered. Megan left that room staggering, the floor feeling like it was opening up beneath her feet. She didn't tell Julia. How could she? How do you tell an 8-year-old girl that her father isn't going to wake up? But Julia, with that sharp perception of children, started asking harder questions. "Mom, when is Dad coming home?" Megan would deflect, saying he needed to stay in the hospital a little longer, until one day Julia asked to visit him. Megan tried to refuse. A child shouldn't see her father in that state. But Julia insisted, begged, and Megan, too exhausted to fight, finally gave in. It was Celia who took the girl to the hospital for the first time. Megan was at work, trying to keep some income flowing to pay the bills that never stopped coming. When she arrived at the ICU that afternoon, she found Julia sitting next to her father's bed, holding his hand with her small ones, talking to him in a low voice. Megan stopped at the door, watching. Julia was telling her dad about her math class, about a fight she had with a classmate, about a dog she'd seen on the street. She spoke naturally, as if Ryan were just asleep and would wake up at any moment to answer. And then something happened that made Megan's heart leap. Julia smiled and said excitedly, "He squeezed my hand, Mom. Daddy squeezed my hand." Megan rushed over, her heart racing, but when she looked at Ryan, he was still motionless. The monitors showed no change. The nurse on duty in the ICU, an experienced woman named Lucy, came over and gently explained that it was a reflex. Involuntary muscle spasms. They happened with patients in a coma. It didn't mean consciousness. Julia looked at the nurse with a determined expression Megan had never seen on her before. "It wasn't a reflex. He squeezed it because I asked him to. He heard me." Lucy smiled patiently, but didn't contradict the girl. Megan, for her part, felt a mix of hope and despair. She wanted to believe. She wanted to believe so badly. In the following days, Julia started going to the hospital every day after school. Celia would pick her up, take her there, and the girl would spend hours by her father's side. She talked, sang the songs he liked, showed him the pictures she drew. The doctors and nurses started to get used to her presence. Some found it beautiful, others sad, but they all agreed it was futile. Ryan wasn't going to wake up. Meanwhile, Megan was sinking deeper and deeper. The bills were piling up. The money they had saved to buy their own house was running out. The costs of medications, private tests, all of it was eating up every penny. She tried to work, but she was so tired she started making mistakes. She was written up by the grocery store manager. She almost lost her job. At night, when she returned to her mother's house, where they were temporarily staying, Megan would break down. She cried hidden in the bathroom so Julia wouldn't hear. She looked at the blue notebook where all the dreams they had built together were written down. The house with a backyard, the trip to the beach, Julia's sweet 16 party. It all seemed so distant now, so impossible. One evening, Megan was in the hospital hallway when she overheard two doctors talking. They were talking about Ryan. One of them was saying it was a shame to keep the patient in that state, that the machines could be turned off, that the family was suffering needlessly. The other agreed. They discussed protocols, procedures, timelines. Megan leaned against the wall, her legs giving out. They were talking about turning off the machines, about letting Ryan go. She knew this was coming, but hearing it discussed so coldly, as if it were just another clinical case, was too much. She slid down the wall until she was sitting on the cold floor of the hallway, hugging her knees, trying to muffle her sobs. That's how Lucy, the nurse, found her. Lucy, who had worked in that ICU for over 15 years, had seen it all. Shattered families, unlikely miracles, heart-wrenching goodbyes. She helped Megan up, took her to the break room, made her some tea, and sat down beside her. Lucy didn't offer empty words of comfort. She didn't say everything would be okay because she knew it might not be. But she said something Megan would never forget. I've seen a lot in this hospital. I've seen patients the doctors said had no chance who came back. I've seen others who had every reason to survive and didn't make it. Medicine is a science, but it's also a mystery. Your daughter believes her father is coming back, and I've seen that faith sometimes can do things that medicine can't explain. Megan looked at Lucy, her eyes red. But the doctors said there's no hope. Lucy nodded. The doctors speak based on statistics, on probabilities, and they're right. Most of the time, but not always. I can't promise you anything, Megan, no one can, but as long as your daughter believes, as long as his heart is beating, maybe there's still something that can be done. Megan didn't know if it was real hope or just desperation clinging to anything it could find. But that night, when she went into the room where Julia was sleeping, she lay down beside her daughter and held her tight. Julia, even in her sleep, snuggled into her mother's arms. And Megan realized that, if not for herself, she had to keep, believing for the sake of this child who refused to accept her father's absence. The next morning, Megan woke up with a determination she didn't know where it came from. She wasn't going to give up yet, not while Ryan's heart was still beating, not while Julia still had faith. She requested a meeting with the medical team. She wanted to know if there was anything at all that could be tried, experimental treatments, alternative therapies, any possibility that hadn't been explored. Dr. Evans and Dr. Wallace received her with some reluctance. They explained again that the damage was severe, that the chances were minimal. But Megan insisted, and that's when Dr. Wallace mentioned something. She had a colleague, Dr. Henry Allen, a neurologist who worked on research into altered states of consciousness. He wasn't on the hospital's permanent staff, but he sometimes visited for consultations. Maybe he could evaluate Ryan's case. Not that it would change the prognosis, but Megan clung to that possibility, like a drowning person to a life raft. She begged them to call this doctor. Dr. Wallace, moved more by compassion than medical hope, agreed to make the call. A few days later, Dr. Henry Allen showed up at the hospital. He was a man in his 50s with graying hair, discreet glasses, and a calm, observant demeanor. He spent hours examining Ryan, analyzing the scans, talking with the team. Afterward, he asked to speak with Megan, and surprisingly with Julia as well. The three of them sat in a small room. Dr. Allen looked at Julia attentively, as if he were genuinely interested in what she had to say. "Tell me, Julia, you said your dad squeezed your hand. Can you tell me what that was like?" Julia, who had been quiet for the past few days, opened up. She told him how she talked to her dad every day, how she sang to him, how she asked him to give her a sign, and how sometimes she felt he responded. Not always. but sometimes. An almost imperceptible movement in his fingers, a slight twitch in his hand. Things the doctors said were reflexes, but that she was sure were not. Dr. Allen listened to everything carefully. Then he looked at Megan. "I can't promise you anything. I want to be very clear about that. The damage Ryan has suffered is real and severe. The chance of recovery is statistically very low, but there is a protocol that's being studied in some medical centers. It's called multisensory stimulation. The idea is to expose the patient to significant stimuli, familiar voices, music he liked, smells, touch. The theory is that these stimuli can, in some rare cases, activate areas of the brain that seem dormant." Megan felt her heart race. "And does it work?" Dr. Allen was honest. "In some cases, it elicits minimal responses. Small movements, changes in brain patterns. In others, it does nothing. It's experimental. It's not a guarantee. But from what I've seen, your daughter is already doing this intuitively. Perhaps we can structure it better, make it more systematic." Julia looked at the doctor, her eyes shining. "Can I keep talking to my dad?" Dr. Allen smiled. "Not only can you must. You're going to be a key part of this." And so a new phase began. Dr. Allen set up a specific protocol for Ryan. His favorite songs would be played at set times. Megan recorded messages, memories of special moments that would be played for him. Julia would continue her daily conversations. Lucy and the nursing. Staff were instructed to perform tactile massages, to use specific scents. Everything to try to reach Ryan wherever he was. For the first few weeks, nothing changed. Ryan remained motionless, the monitors showing the same patterns. Megan started to lose hope again, but Julia didn't. The girl went every single day without fail, talked to her dad, sang, told him stories, and she kept insisting that he could hear her. It was on an afternoon in April, almost a month after the protocol began, that something different happened. Megan was sitting by Ryan's bed, exhausted, nearly asleep. Julia had just left with Celia. The small radio they had placed in the room was playing a song Ryan loved, an old country song he always used to hum while he worked. And then Megan saw it. A movement, almost imperceptible, but definite. The index finger on Ryan's right hand moved, just a small twitch, but Megan was absolutely certain it wasn't her imagination. She called for Lucy, who came running. They watched. Minutes later, it happened again. Another movement, slightly more noticeable. Lucy checked the monitors. There was a subtle change in the brainwave patterns. Nothing dramatic, but something different from what had been seen in recent weeks. She noted everything, called the medical team. Dr. Wallace came, examined him, ordered new tests. Everyone remained skeptical, but there was something there. Something was changing. When Julia found out the next day, she hugged her mother so tightly that Megan almost lost her balance. "I knew it, Mum. I knew he was listening to me." And it continued. Every day, with even more dedication, Julia spoke to her father. She told him about school, about her friends, about their plans for when he came home. And Megan, who had been so close to giving up, felt something she hadn't felt in weeks. A small, fragile, but real spark of hope. The movements became more frequent, always small, always subtle, but consistent, and they always seemed to happen when Julia was nearby. Dr. Allen visited again, examined the new data, and for the first time since the beginning said something Megan didn't expect. There might be a chance. Maybe. That was all. But for Megan and Julia, maybe was more than enough. It was a door that had been shut and was now very slowly beginning to creak open. They didn't know what was on the other side. They didn't know if Ryan would be able to come back completely, but for the first time since that terrible March morning, they allowed themselves to dream again. Julia went home that night, humming the same song that was playing in the hospital room. Megan watched her, and for the first time in weeks truly smiled. There was still a long road ahead. There were still uncertainties, fears, immense obstacles, but now at least there was a road, and they were going to walk it together step by step to the end. May arrived, bringing the first cool mornings to Denver, that distinctive climate where the sun still warms the day, but the nights call for a jacket. In the ICU at University Hospital, Ryan continued his suspended existence between being and not being, while around him, life reorganized itself around this new reality. Megan had managed to negotiate reduced hours at the grocery store, which meant less money, but more time at the hospital. Julia maintained her unwavering routine: school, homework in the waiting room, a visit with her dad, then back to her grandmother's house. The small movements that had started to appear became more defined. It was nothing dramatic. Ryan didn't open his eyes, didn't speak, didn't show signs of full consciousness, but his fingers responded to stimuli more frequently. Once, when Megan played a song from their wedding, he moved his head slightly. The doctors remained cautious, explaining that this could still be just reflex activity, but Dr. Allen seemed genuinely intrigued. He returned to the hospital every week, examining the data, adjusting the protocol. It was during one of these visits that Lucy, the nurse, pulled Megan into a corner of the hallway. There was something she needed to tell her. For the past few days, a man had been showing up at the hospital, always in the afternoon when it was busiest. He would stand at a distance, watching through the ICU window, never entering or identifying himself. He was a man in his 60s, with graying hair, stooped shoulders, and an expression Lucy described as someone carrying the weight of the world. That very afternoon, Lucy saw him again. This time he was closer, looking through the glass with an intensity that seemed painful. Megan followed the nurse's gaze and saw him. Her heart stopped. She knew. That man, or rather she knew him through the rare stories Ryan told. Anthony, Ryan's father, the man who had disappeared from his son's life more than 12 years ago after a fight that no one ever wanted to fully explain to Megan. A wave of anger surged through Megan's chest. How dare he? After all this time, all the abandonment, all the silence, he shows up now. When Ryan was like this, unable to defend him or tell him to leave. She marched to the ICU door, stepped into the hallway, and faced Anthony. The two stood opposite each, other for a moment that felt like an eternity. Anthony spoke first. His voice was hoarse, as if it hadn't been used for important things in a long time. "I heard about the accident. A neighbor told me. I had to see." Megan crossed her arms, her posture defensive. "See? After being gone for 12 years, you show up to see?" Anthony lowered his head. He had no defense, and he knew it. "I know I have no right. I know I was a coward. But he's my son, Megan. My only son." Megan felt tears burn in her eyes, but refused to let them fall. "He was your son when you left too, when he got married, when Julia was born. Where were you?" Anthony swallowed hard. "I was scared, ashamed, angry at myself. I made bad choices, Megan. I destroyed my family. And when I realized the extent of the damage, I thought it would be better to stay away, that they'd be better off without me." Megan shook her head. She didn't want to hear excuses. "Ryan was never better off without you. He missed you every single day, especially at the beginning. Then he learned to move on. He built a life without you, a family. And now you show up because he's in a hospital bed?" Anthony closed his eyes, the pain evident on his face. "I know I can't fix the past, but I needed to see him, even if it's from a distance." Megan was about to tell him to leave, to say he had no right to be there, that he had already caused enough pain. But just then, Julia appeared in the hallway, coming from the waiting room with Celia. The girl stopped when she saw the two adults, in confrontation, then looked at Anthony with the natural curiosity of children. She didn't know him, had never seen a picture, but there was something in her expression that suggested recognition, as if the stories she'd been told had created an image in her mind. Julia approached, looking at the man. "Do you know my dad?" Anthony looked at the granddaughter he had never met, and something inside him broke. The tears he had held back for so many years began to fall. He knelt to be at her level, maintaining a respectful distance. "Yes, I've known your dad since. He was a little boy, smaller than you." Julia tilted her head. "Are you my grandpa?" Anthony nodded, unable to speak. Julia was silent for a moment, processing. Then, with the devastating simplicity of children, she said, "My dad is sick, but he's going to get better. You can really meet him when he wakes up." Megan watched the scene and felt something shift inside her. The anger was still there, solid and justified. But there was something else. Maybe compassion. Maybe exhaustion. Maybe the realization that at that moment, holding on to old grudges was a luxury she couldn't afford. She sighed, ran a hand through her hair and looked at Celia, who was observing everything with her silent wisdom. Her mother just nodded, as if to say, "Let the girl decide." Megan looked at Anthony, her voice still cold but less aggressive. "You can stay, but don't make Julia suffer. She's already going through enough." Anthony stood up, wiping his face with the back of his hand. "Thank you. I promise." And so, Anthony became part of that strange and painful routine. He showed up every day, always at the same time, always quiet. He would sit in the waiting room, talking softly with Julia about simple things, school cartoons, the books she was reading. He never tried to act like an instant grandfather. He seemed to understand that it had to be earned, that there were no shortcuts to trust. Megan watched him from a distance, still suspicious. Celia, on the other hand, spoke with him a few times. She found out that Anthony lived alone in a small apartment downtown, that he worked as a night watchman at a parking garage, that he had spent the last few years in a self-imposed loneliness that seemed to have aged him prematurely. Celia, who had always been more forgiving than her daughter, began to soften. She recognized a man destroyed by guilt when she saw one. Julia, for her part, accepted her grandfather with the capacity only children have to see people without the layers of judgment adults accumulate. She didn't understand the old fights, the resentments, the hurt feelings. She just saw a sad man who wanted to know his son. And, in her simple logic, that was enough. One afternoon, Julia asked Anthony to come into the ICU with her. Megan hesitated, but Dr. Allen, who was present, encouraged it. "Varied stimuli," he said. "Different voices." Anthony followed his granddaughter with hesitant steps, as if he were walking to his own execution. When he saw Ryan in that bed, connected to the machines, his face pale and still, Anthony broke down. He grabbed the arm of the chair beside him, his legs failing. Julia took his hand, small and firm. "Don't cry, Grandpa. Daddy doesn't like it when people cry." Anthony sat down, looking at the son he hadn't seen in so long. Ryan had been a boy when he left. Now he was a man marked by life, by hard work, by responsibilities. Anthony held his son's hand, feeling the weight of all the lost years. He began to speak, his voice choked. He apologized for leaving, for being weak, for not being there when Ryan built his life. He said he would understand if Ryan could never forgive him, but he needed him to know the regret had been a burden he carried every single day. Julia stood by, listening. Then, in her clear voice, she said, "Grandpa, tell him about things you like, happy things. He likes happy things." Anthony wiped his eyes and tried. He started telling stories from when Ryan was little, how he loved to play baseball in the field near their house, how he was afraid of thunder and would run to his father's arms, how, when he was about 5, he decided he wanted to be a firefighter and spent months wearing a red plastic helmet. Stories Megan had never heard, that Ryan rarely told because they came from a time that was too painful to revisit. And something extraordinary happened. As Anthony spoke, the monitors began to show changes, small but definite. Dr. Allen, who had come in to observe, noted everything. He called Dr. Wallace. The two doctors analyzed the data with expressions of controlled surprise. Ryan's brain activity had changed during that conversation. It wasn't just reflexes anymore. It was something different, something that suggested cognitive processing, however minimal. In the following weeks, the protocol was intensified. Anthony became an active part of it. He recorded messages about moments from Ryan's childhood, which were played through the headphones they had placed on him. Megan, initially resistant, allowed Anthony to participate more, not because she had completely forgiven him, but because she saw that, in some inexplicable way, it was helping. Julia remained the center of it all. She coordinated, without knowing she was doing it, the entire operation. She would say when it was time for music, when it was time to talk, when her dad needed quiet. And Ryan's responses, became increasingly consistent. The finger movements turned into firmer hand squeezes. Once, when Julia sang a song he used to sing to put her to sleep, Ryan moved his lips as if trying to follow along. The medical team, even the most skeptical, began to admit that something unusual was happening. It wasn't recovery, not yet, but it was change. It was life trying to return. Dr. Allen presented the case at a medical conference, describing how the combination of structured familiar stimuli with constant emotional presence seemed to be provoking responses that defied the initial prognosis. But it wasn't all hope. The family's financial situation had become critical. The money they had saved was gone weeks ago. Megan had to sell their car. Celia had pawned some family jewelry. And still, it wasn't enough. The medical costs, even with their insurance covering part, were astronomical. Specific medications, procedures, tests, everything cost more than they had. That's when Anthony made a decision. He owned an apartment. It wasn't much, an old 2-bedroom downtown, but it was his, paid off. It was the only thing left from his broken marriage, from the life he had destroyed. He put it up for sale. When Megan found out, she tried to refuse. They couldn't accept it. Anthony left no room for discussion. "It's the least I can do. I wasn't there when I should have been. Let me be here now." The apartment sold quickly. The money covered the accumulated medical debts and secured a few more months of treatment. Megan, for the first time since Anthony had reappeared, hugged him. It wasn't a hug of complete forgiveness, but of recognition, of gratitude, of accepting that people, no matter how bad their mistakes, could try to make amends. And then, on a June afternoon, it happened. Julia was making her daily visit, telling her dad about a school project. She was holding his hand, as she always did, and she asked, as she always asked, "Squeeze my hand, Dad. Let me know you're listening." And Ryan squeezed. It wasn't a reflex, it wasn't an involuntary spasm, it was a conscious, firm, deliberate squeeze. Julia screamed with joy. Megan, who was on the other side of the ICU, came running. Lucy arrived soon after. They saw it when Ryan did it again. And again. Every time Julia asked, he responded. Dr. Wallace was called. She ran tests. She asked Ryan to squeeze once for yes, twice for no, and he answered simple questions correctly. His name, if he was in pain, if he recognized Julia's voice. The doctors looked at each other, incredulous. This wasn't supposed to be happening. Statistically, it was almost impossible, but it was happening. Dr. Allen, when he heard, rushed back to the hospital. He examined Ryan, repeated the tests, analyzed the new imaging scans. There was increased brain activity. Areas that had seemed dead were showing signs of function. It was as if, somehow, the brain was finding new pathways, bypassing the damage. Neuroplasticity, he explained, was one of medicine's greatest mysteries. And sometimes, in very rare cases, things happened that challenged everything we thought we knew. That night, the whole family gathered in the ICU. Megan, Julia, Celia, and even Anthony. They stood around Ryan's bed. Julia, with tears in her eyes, held her father's hand. "I knew you'd come back, I always knew." And then, for the first time in 3 months, Ryan opened his eyes. Just a sliver, just for a few seconds. But it was enough. He looked at Julia. He saw his daughter, and he squeezed her hand again, this time with more strength. The whole hospital found out. Nurses who had followed the case from the beginning cried. Doctors who had written Ryan off came to see with their own eyes. Lucy, who had seen so much over the years, said it was one of the most beautiful moments she had ever witnessed. Megan hugged Julia and cried. She cried out all the fear, all the despair, all the exhaustion of the past few months. Celia prayed silently, giving thanks, and Anthony, standing in the corner of the room, watched the scene with a mix of joy and pain. Joy at seeing his son returning, pain at knowing he had almost not been there for it. Julia then did something unexpected. She went to Anthony, took his hand, and led him to the bed. "Grandpa, talk to him. He needs to hear you too." Anthony hesitated. Megan was about to intervene, but Julia looked at her with that determination that had become her trademark in recent months. Megan nodded, giving silent permission. Anthony approached. Ryan had closed his eyes again, but his hand was still outstretched, fingers slightly open. Anthony took it, feeling the touch of his son for the first time in 12 years. "Ryan, I know you can hear me now. I know I did things you might never be able to forgive. I abandoned you when you needed me most. I was a coward, but I want you to know that never, not for one day, did I stop thinking about you. I never stopped regretting it. And if you give me a chance, I'll spend the rest of my days trying to be the father I always should have been." The room fell silent. Megan held Julia, both of them watching, and then, slowly, Ryan's fingers moved. He squeezed Anthony's hand. It wasn't as strong as his squeeze for Julia, but it was undeniable. It was real. It was forgiveness. Anthony broke down. He rested his head on the bed next to his son's hand and cried like he hadn't cried since he left his family. Megan looked at him and felt something in her chest release. The anger she had carried, the righteous indignation, it was all replaced by something simpler: compassion. Because if Ryan, in his fragile state, could still find room to forgive, who was she to deny it? In the following days, Ryan's improvement continued. His eyes opened more frequently, his movements became more coordinated. He still wasn't speaking, the tracheostomy tube prevented it, but his eyes said everything. He recognized everyone: Julia, Megan, Celia, even Anthony. And always, when Julia entered the room, he tried to smile. It was a crooked, difficult smile, but it was a father's smile for his daughter. The medical team began to talk about transferring him to the rehabilitation unit. Ryan had a long road ahead of him. The physical therapy would be intense. Speech therapy would be necessary. Full recovery, if it happened at all, would take months, maybe years. But for the first time they used the word recovery. Not a complete cure, but recovery. And for Megan and Julia, that word was like music. The community where the family lived began to rally. The news of the university hospital. Miracle spread. The local newspaper ran a story about Ryan and Julia. People started to help. The grocery store where Megan worked started a collection drive. Julia's school organized a bake sale where the kids sold drawings and crafts. Ryan's former co-workers started a GoFundMe. In a few weeks, they had raised enough money to cover the next few months of treatment. Ryan's old boss, Mr. Miller, a 60-year-old man who had built his small construction company from scratch, came to the hospital. He had been devastated when he heard about the accident. He had blamed himself, though everyone knew. It wasn't his fault. When he saw Ryan awake, his eyes welled up. He promised that his job would be waiting for him. When Ryan could come back, even in a modified role, there would be a place for him. Because good men, he said, were rare, and Ryan was one of them. Megan listened to all of this and realized something she had forgotten in recent months. They weren't alone. They never had been. Life had dealt them a brutal blow, had thrown their family into the depths of despair. But the hands reaching out to help them climb. Back up were many. Neighbors, friends, strangers moved by their story. They were all part of the miracle. Julia, sitting in the chair next to her father's bed, held a notebook where she had started to write everything down. Every small victory, every significant moment. It was, she told her mother, for when her dad was completely better and could read it. A record of how they had fought and won together. Ryan, watching his daughter write, tried to lift his hand. It was difficult. His arm felt like lead, but he managed. He touched Julia's hair, a minimal gesture that meant the world to them. Julia dropped the notebook and hugged her father's arm, resting her face against it. "You came back, Dad. You really came back." And Megan, seeing that, knew they had been through the worst. There were still immense challenges ahead. The rehabilitation would be long and painful. The scars, both physical and emotional, would take time to heal. But they were together. And with Julia showing that faith can move mountains, with Anthony proving it's never too late to fix mistakes, with the community demonstrating that solidarity is real, they would find their way. That night, as they left the hospital, Julia looked up at the starry Denver sky and smiled. Megan, holding her daughter's hand, asked what she was thinking. Julia answered with the simple wisdom that only children possess. "That miracles are real, Mom. We just have to believe in them." And in that moment, under the cold June stars, Megan believed. July and August brought an intense cold to Denver, that dry mountain chill that seeps into your bones and makes the mornings slow to brighten. But inside the rehabilitation unit at University Hospital, where Ryan had been transferred after leaving the ICU, there was a different kind of warmth. It was the warmth of the daily struggle, of the effort that hurts but brings results, of the determination of a man who had returned from the threshold between life and absence and now had to relearn almost everything. Ryan had fully awakened from the coma in the second week of June. The process wasn't instantaneous like in the movies. It was gradual, confusing, painful. First came moments of consciousness, interspersed with periods of deep sleep. Then consciousness became more constant but hazy, as if he were wrapped in a thick fog. He recognized people, but couldn't fully process where he was or what had happened. The memory of the accident was non-existent. The last things he remembered were fragments. He was working. He had gone up to check something, then nothing. A black void. Megan and Dr. Allen explained everything patiently. The accident, the electric shock, the cardiac arrest, the months in a coma. Ryan listened with a dazed expression, as if they were telling someone else's story. When he finally understood how much time had passed, 3 whole months of his life simply erased, he cried. Megan held his hand, and Julia, who was always nearby, hugged her father's arm and said, "But you're back now, Dad, and we're going to help you get strong again." The removal of the tracheostomy tube was a major milestone. Ryan could finally speak, though his voice came out hoarse and weak at first. The first words he managed to articulate were for Julia, "My little warrior." The girl burst into tears of joy, and Megan wasn't far behind. But the initial euphoria soon gave way to the harsh reality of rehabilitation. The neurological damage had primarily affected the left side of his body. Ryan had severe motor difficulties. He couldn't stand on his own. The movements of his left arm were limited and uncoordinated. He had trouble swallowing, which made eating a slow and frustrating process. His speech, though possible, was slurred. And there were cognitive issues, difficulty concentrating, short-term memory lapses, mental fatigue that came on far too quickly. The physical therapist in charge, Fernanda, a young and energetic woman who had worked at the hospital for 5 years, didn't sugarcoat the situation. She explained that the road would be long, many months, maybe years. There would be progress, but also plateaus and frustrations. Some deficits might never be completely overcome. Ryan would have to work harder than he had ever worked in his entire life, and even then, there were no guarantees. Ryan heard all of this and felt something he hadn't felt since waking up. Fear. Not fear of dying, that was behind him, but fear of not being able to do it. Fear of being a burden to his family. Fear of never being able to work again, never being able to be the father and husband he had been. When Fernanda left the room, he looked at Megan, his eyes full of tears. "What if I can't do it? What if I'm like this forever?" Megan held his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. "You will do it, because you're the most determined man I know, because you have a daughter who believed in you when everyone said it was impossible, and because we didn't go through all of this just to give up now." Julia, who had been listening from the doorway, ran in and climbed onto the bed next to her father, with the care that was now instinctive to avoid touching the tubes and wires still connected to him. "Dad, remember when you taught me to ride a bike? I fell 1,000,000 times, but you stayed by my side and said I could do it. Now it's my turn to stay by your side." Ryan hugged his daughter with his right arm, the only one that responded well, and let the tears fall. They were tears of fear, yes, but also of gratitude, of love, of renewed determination. The rehabilitation routine began the next day, and it was brutal. Physical therapy twice a day. Speech therapy to work on his speech and swallowing. Occupational therapy to relearn basic tasks like holding a cup or using utensils. Each session was a challenge that left Ryan exhausted. At first, he could barely sit in a wheelchair for more than 20 minutes without feeling dizzy. The physical therapy exercises, which seemed simple to any healthy person, were insurmountable mountains for him. Fernanda was firm, but empathetic. She knew when to push and when to back off. In the early days, the focus was just on basic mobility, moving his toes, bending his knee, lifting his arm a few inches. Every movement was celebrated as a victory. Julia, who came to the hospital every day after school, created a system. She made a large poster divided into squares where she marked each of her father's achievements. When he managed to do something new, she colored a square red. The goal, she explained, was to fill the entire poster. Ryan looked at that poster every day. In moments of despair, when the pain was so great he wanted to give up, it was Julia's poster that motivated him. Each red square was proof that he was progressing, even if slowly. The community remained mobilized. Julia's school organized a visiting schedule. Each week, a few mothers took turns bringing home-cooked meals for Megan, who practically lived at the hospital. The neighbors looked after the house they used to live in, which had been closed up since the accident. The grocery store where Megan worked held another fundraiser, this time to collect money for the rehabilitation equipment Ryan would need at home. Anthony, who had sold his apartment and was now living in a rented room near the hospital, showed up every day. He had taken on an unofficial but vital role. He was always available. Need something picked up. Anthony would go. Need someone to stay with Ryan while Megan dealt with paperwork? Anthony would stay. Julia need a ride to school? Anthony would take her. He had understood that atoning for years of absence wasn't about grand gestures, but about being present in the small daily moments. The relationship between Ryan and Anthony, however, was complex. Ryan had woken up remembering the fight, the hurt, the abandonment. Forgiveness is a process, not a single event. There were days when Ryan could talk to his father, accept his presence. There were others when the old anger returned and he would ask Anthony to leave. Megan mediated these situations with patience. She reminded Ryan that his father was trying. She reminded Anthony that some wounds take time to heal. It was Julia, once again, who served as the bridge. She didn't understand the adult complications, the old resentments. She just saw that her grandfather was there, helping every single day, and to her, that's what mattered. She started telling her father about the things her grandfather did, how he helped her with her homework, how he had fixed her torn backpack, how he knew funny stories from when her dad was a kid. Slowly through the bridge Julia was building, Ryan began to soften. At the end of July, after nearly 6 weeks in rehab, came the first major victory. Ryan managed to stand on his own. Not walk, just stand. Fernanda and another therapist helped him up from the wheelchair, holding him by the arms. But when he was upright, his legs held his weight. For 10 seconds, then 20, then a full minute. Ryan, looking at his own reflection in the mirror of the physical therapy room, saw himself standing for the first time in 4 months and began to cry. Julia, who was watching from the door with Megan, ran and hugged her father's legs. "I knew you could do it. I knew it." Fernanda smiled but was pragmatic. "This is excellent, Ryan. But it's just the beginning. Now comes the hardest part." And it was. Standing was one thing. Walking was something else entirely. The first attempts were disastrous. Even with full support, Ryan could barely move one leg in front of the other. His coordination was devastated. His balance was non-existent. The frustration was immense. He fell. A lot. Even with the therapists holding him, his legs would give out and he would collapse. Each fall was a blow to his ego, his hope, his determination. There was one day in early August when Ryan hit his limit. He had fallen for the 5th time in that session. The physical pain was bearable, but the emotional pain was unbearable. He screamed, slammed his good hand on the floor and said he couldn't take it anymore, that it was useless, that he would never walk again, that it would have been better if they had just left the machines off. Fernanda let him vent. When the silence returned, she knelt beside him. "Do you think you're the only one who goes through this? I've worked here for 5 years, Ryan. I've seen people with worse injuries than yours walk again. I've seen others who had every reason to recover and gave up. Do you know what the difference was? It wasn't the severity of the injury. It was the choice to keep trying, even when everything seemed impossible." Ryan looked at her, his eyes red. "I am trying." Fernanda nodded. "I know. And you're going to keep trying. Because your daughter is out there, waiting to color another square on her poster. Because your wife hasn't slept properly in 4 months, but she's still here believing in you. Because your father, who carried guilt for 12 years, sold everything he had to help you. You're not fighting alone, Ryan. So get up. Get up and try again. Ryan stayed on the floor for a few more seconds. Then, with help, he got up, and he tried again, and he fell again. But he got up one more time, and another, and another. The weeks of August were an emotional roller coaster. There were days of clear progress. Ryan could take 3 steps on his own, then 5, then 10, holding on to the parallel bars in the PT room. There were also days of plateau, where it seemed like nothing was changing, that all the effort was in vain. And there were days of regression, where he couldn't do what he had done the day before, where physical and mental exhaustion left him unable to function. Megan watched it all closely. She had learned to read Ryan's moods, to know when he needed encouragement and when he needed space. She herself was exhausted. She had lost weight, developed chronic insomnia, lived with constant headaches. Celia worried about her daughter as much as her son-in-law, but Megan refused to slow down. Not yet, not until Ryan was better. The first time Ryan walked without support was at the end of August. Fernanda had planned the attempt carefully. First, he practiced exhaustively with the parallel bars, then with a walker. When she deemed him ready, she removed everything. She stood Ryan in the center of the room, took a few steps back, and held out her hands. "Come to me." Ryan looked at the distance. It was maybe 6 steps. It might as well have been 6 miles. He took a deep breath. Julia was there, along with Megan, Celia, and Anthony. They had all been called for this moment. Ryan looked at his daughter, who was smiling with absolute confidence. He thought about everything he had been through. The accident, the coma, the lost months, the daily struggle. He thought that 6 steps were nothing compared to all that, and he took the first step. His left leg was still weak, but it obeyed. He stumbled, but didn't fall. Second step. Third. On the 4th, he almost lost his balance, but managed to correct himself. 5th step. 6th step. And then he was in Fernanda's hands, who held him and smiled with genuine pride. The room erupted in applause. Julia screamed with joy and ran to hug her father. Megan was crying non-stop. Celia prayed softly, and Anthony, leaning against the wall, discreetly wiped his eyes. Ryan had walked, on his own, without support. 6 steps that were more than 6 steps. They were proof that the impossible was possible. After that day, everything accelerated. Ryan practiced walking every day, several times a day. By the 3rd week of September, he could cross the hospital hallway without support. He still walked slowly, still limped on his left side, still needed frequent breaks. But he walked. His speech had also improved. Though he still slurred some words, he could hold long conversations. His fine motor skills were gradually returning. He could hold a cup, use a fork, write, even with shaky handwriting. Dr. Allen, who continued to follow the case, called Ryan's progress one of the most remarkable examples of neurological recovery he had seen in his career. He was documenting everything for a study he planned to publish. Not just about the sensory stimulation protocol, but about the role of emotional bonds in the recovery of neurological patients. Julia, without knowing it, had become part of research that could change medical approaches in the future. At the end of September, the news they had all been waiting for arrived. Ryan was being discharged. Not a full discharge, but discharged from the hospital. He would continue with physical therapy, speech therapy, and neurological follow-ups, but now as an outpatient. He could go home. But there was a problem. The apartment they lived in before was on the 3rd floor with no elevator. Ryan wasn't able to climb stairs yet. Megan, Celia, and Anthony gathered to discuss options. It was Celia who offered the solution. Her house. It was a single-story home with 3 bedrooms and a small backyard. She had lived alone since being widowed 5 years ago. There was room for everyone. Megan hesitated. She didn't want to burden her mother, but Celia was firm. "You're my family. This house has always been yours too. Besides, I'd love to have my granddaughter around every day. Celia's house was in the Washington Park neighborhood, a traditional part of Denver with tree-lined streets and older homes. The house itself was simple but cozy, painted white with blue trim, with a small front porch where Celia used to sit in the afternoons. The master bedroom was adapted for Ryan. They removed some furniture to install the support bars he needed. The bathroom was equipped with safety bars and a shower bench. The move happened on a sunny afternoon in October. Ryan left the hospital in a wheelchair, but when he arrived at Celia's house, he insisted on walking in. He took each step carefully, leaning on Megan on one side and Anthony on the other. When he crossed the front door, everyone applauded. Julia had made a handmade banner, "Welcome home, Daddy." Ryan looked around the house that would now be his home. It wasn't what they had planned. It wasn't the house with a backyard they had dreamed of buying, but it was home because the people he loved were there. He sat on the living room sofa and for the first time in 7 months felt something resembling normalcy. Adapting to life at home was a different challenge. In the hospital, everything was structured, supervised. At home, Ryan had to deal with everyday situations that revealed his limitations. He needed help getting dressed, taking a shower, simple tasks like opening a bottle or tying his shoes. It was humiliating, frustrating, but Megan and Julia never made him feel less for it. They helped with a natural ease, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. A routine was established. Megan went back to work part-time. Anthony, who had found a job as a janitor in a nearby building, adjusted his schedule to stay with Ryan during the day. Julia went to school and came back at lunchtime, staying with her dad while Anthony went to work. Celia took care of the house, cooked, and made sure everyone ate properly. It was a complex orchestration, but it worked. Ryan continued with intensive therapies. 3 times a week, Anthony took him to his physical therapy sessions at the hospital. Fernanda kept pushing him, setting increasingly ambitious goals. Walk a block without stopping, climb 3 steps, stand for 20 minutes straight. Each goal achieved was celebrated, each missed goal was turned into motivation for the next attempt. Julia continued with her poster, now hanging on her dad's bedroom wall. The red squares multiplied. She had established a color system: red for physical achievements, blue for cognitive achievements, green for emotional achievements. The poster had become a visual map of Ryan's recovery. At night, after dinner, the whole family would gather in the living room. They talked, watched TV, played simple games that Ryan could participate in. Anthony started teaching Julia to play dominoes, the same game he used to play with Ryan when he was a child. Ryan watched, and slowly, the old hurt gave way to a new acceptance. The father who had abandoned him was not the same man who was here now, every day helping, trying. People changed. Forgiveness didn't erase the past, but it made room for a different future. In November, Ryan was discharged from the speech therapist. His speech had almost completely normalized. Some words still came out slurred when he was tired, but generally you could talk to him without noticing much of a difference. It was a significant victory. In December, he managed to climb a full flight of stairs for the first time. It was at Mr. Miller's house, his old boss, who had invited the family for lunch. The house had a 2nd floor, and when Ryan saw the stairs, he felt the old fear. But Julia held his hand and said, "We'll climb together, Dad." And they did. 18 steps. Ryan had to stop 3 times to rest, but he reached the top. Mr. Miller, watching from above, hugged him tightly. "Welcome back, son." It was at that lunch that Mr. Miller reiterated what he had said months ago. There was a place for Ryan at the company. Not on the construction sites, not yet, maybe never again in roles that required intense physical labor. But in the office, helping with bids, with planning, with supervision, Ryan was smart. He understood construction, he had experience. Those things didn't disappear with a brain injury. Ryan thanked him, emotional. He had thought he would never be able to work again, that he would be dependent on his family forever. Mr. Miller's offer wasn't charity. It was recognition. It was a chance to reclaim not just his body, but his dignity, his usefulness, his purpose. In January of the following year, Ryan made his first visit to a construction site. Not to work, just to visit. When he arrived, his old co-workers surrounded him. Mark, who had been there on the day of the accident and had carried guilt ever since, hugged Ryan and apologized repeatedly. Ryan reassured him. It wasn't anyone's fault. It was an accident. These things happened. Ryan looked at the building being constructed. It was different from the one where he'd been hurt, but the essence was the same. Concrete, steel, hard work turning a blueprint into reality. He missed it. He missed the work, the routine, the feeling of building something with his own hands, but he knew that time had passed. Now he would build, in other ways. That night at home, Ryan talked to Megan. He told her about Mr. Miller's offer, about his desire to go back to work. Megan listened and smiled. "I think you're ready. You've done so much, overcome so much. This is just one more mountain." Ryan shook his head. "It's not a mountain. I've already climbed mountains. This is flat ground, and I'm ready to walk on it." And so, in February, 9 months after the accident, Ryan started working again. Part-time, in the contractor's office. He learned to use the computer programs, studied spreadsheets, reviewed blueprints. It was different from what he had done his whole life, but it was work. It was a contribution. It was the recovery not just of his body, but of his identity. Julia celebrated by coloring the last square on the poster red. She had decided the poster would only be complete when her dad went back to work, and now it was. She hung the poster on the living room wall for everyone to see. It was a map of their journey. Each square was a battle won. Each color was an area of life reclaimed. Ryan looked at that poster and saw in it the unwavering faith of an 8-year-old girl who had refused to accept that her father wouldn't come back. He also saw the determination of a wife who had carried the weight of everything on her shoulders. He saw the regret turned into action of an absent father who was now present. He saw the generosity of a mother-in-law who had opened her home and her heart. He saw the solidarity of a community that had rallied. He saw, in short, proof that miracles happen. Not the way we imagine, not like instant magic, but as the result of effort, love, faith, and a refusal to give up. March arrived, bringing the first autumn rains, those quick downpours that fall over Denver on warm afternoons and leave the air smelling of wet earth. At Celia's house, the routine had settled into a comforting rhythm. Ryan worked part-time at the construction company, came home in the early afternoon, did his physical therapy exercises, and helped Julia with her homework. Megan had managed to negotiate a better schedule at the grocery store. Anthony visited regularly, usually on weekends when the whole family gathered for lunch. Life, if not, exactly as it had been before the accident, had found a new balance. But it was just when everything seemed to be falling into place that the cracks began to appear. And this time, not in Ryan, but in Julia. It started with headaches. Julia complained of pain when she woke up, pain in the middle of the afternoon, pain before bed. Megan thought it was because the girl was spending too much time in front of the TV or tablet, so she limited her screen time. But the headaches continued. Then came the dizzy spells. Julia was playing in the backyard when suddenly everything spun, and she had to sit down. At school, during gym class, she felt sick and was taken to the nurse's office. Megan and Ryan started to worry. They took Julia to her pediatrician, Dr. Peterson, who had seen her since she was a baby. He ran blood tests, checked her blood pressure, examined her eyes. Everything was normal. He suggested it could just be a growth spurt, hormonal changes, Julia's body entering pre-adolescence. He recommended they watch her for a few more weeks, but the weeks passed and the symptoms worsened. Julia started experiencing weakness in her legs. Sometimes, for no apparent reason, her legs would simply give out and she would fall. She didn't faint, but it was as if her body refused to hold her up. Megan started having panic attacks. It couldn't be happening again, not to her daughter, not after everything they had been through. Ryan tried to stay calm, but inside he was terrified. He knew better than anyone what it was like to have your body fail you without understanding why. The idea of Julia going through something similar was unbearable. They went back to Dr. Peterson, who was more concerned this time. He ordered more specific tests, an MRI, an EEG, a full neurological workup. The day they went to get the results, was one of the most agonizing Megan had experienced since Ryan's accident. She and Ryan sat in Dr. Peterson's office, hands clasped, expecting the worst. The doctor laid the scans on his desk one by one, and then he said the words they most wanted to hear. Everything was normal. There were no brain lesions, no tumors, nothing neurologically wrong with Julia. Megan started to cry with relief. Ryan let out a breath he didn't even know he was holding. But then Dr. Peterson continued. Just because there was nothing physically wrong didn't mean there was nothing wrong. Julia's symptoms were real. She wasn't making them up or faking. Something was causing these physical manifestations, and he thought he knew what it was. Dr. Peterson explained that he had discussed the case with a colleague, Dr. Paula Mendez, a child psychologist specializing in trauma, and they both agreed that Julia was showing classic symptoms of post-traumatic stress. The headaches, dizziness, weakness, it was all the physical manifestation of an emotional burden that had been suppressed for months. Megan was confused. Post-traumatic stress? Julia hadn't been the victim of the accident. She hadn't been in the ICU. How could she have trauma? Dr. Peterson was gentle but direct. Julia had experienced the trauma of seeing her father on the brink of death. She had taken on an enormous emotional responsibility by becoming, in a way, the family's anchor of hope. For months, while everyone around her was in despair, she had remained strong, positive, confident. But that strength came at a price, and now that the crisis was over, now that her father was better, her body was demanding payment. Ryan heard this and felt his heart shatter. His little warrior, as he called her, had been wounded while saving him. While he was fighting to come back, she had worn herself out, keeping everyone's faith alive. It was a devastating revelation, and at the same time filled with a painful logic. He looked at Megan, saw her tears, and knew she was feeling the same. Dr. Peterson recommended that Julia start seeing Dr. Mendez as soon as possible. He also suggested that the whole family participate in some sessions, because trauma rarely affects just one person in isolation. It affects the entire family system. The next day, Julia had her first appointment with Dr. Mendez. The psychologist was a woman in her 40s, with a warmly decorated office filled with colorful pillows, toys, and children's books on the shelves. She greeted Julia with a warm smile, and unlike the other doctors, didn't start by asking about her symptoms. She asked about ordinary things, what Julia liked to do, what her favorite subject in school was, if she had close friends. Julia, naturally wary at first, began to open up. Dr. Mendez had a way of asking questions that felt like a conversation, not an interrogation. Slowly, she guided the dialogue toward the period of her father's accident. How had Julia felt? What did she remember? What was she most afraid of? And it was there, in that welcoming office, that Julia finally allowed the emotions she had bottled up for so long to surface. She told, between sobs, that she was afraid to sleep because she thought if she stopped thinking about her dad, he would die. That every night, before closing her eyes, she would pray and ask to wake up and find him, still alive. That at the hospital, when she talked to her dad all those days, it wasn't just because she believed he would wake up. It was because she was afraid that if she stopped talking, he would leave forever. Dr. Mendez listened with compassionate attention. Then she explained something to Julia that no one had explained before. It wasn't her responsibility to save her father. Her father had saved himself with the help of doctors, therapists, and his own effort. Julia's love had been important, yes, but the outcome didn't depend on her. She didn't have to carry that. Wait, she never had to. Julia looked at the psychologist with a confused expression. But if I hadn't believed, if I hadn't talked to him every day, would he have woken up? Dr. Mendez was careful with her answer. I think you helped, Julia. I think your love made a difference, but it wasn't your job to make sure he survived. That was the doctor's job and the job of your dad's own body. You're a child, and children shouldn't have to save their parents. Children should be allowed to be children. It was as if a dam had broken. Julia cried like she hadn't cried since the day of the accident. She cried out all the responsibility she had placed on herself, all the fear she had hidden, all the strength she had pretended to have when she was actually terrified. Dr. Mendez let her cry, offering only her presence and understanding. The sessions became part of Julia's routine. Twice a week, after school, Megan took her to the office. At first, Julia resisted. She said she was fine, that she didn't need help. But Dr. Mendez had a way of making her see that seeking help wasn't weakness. It was courage. That taking care of your mind was just as important as taking care of your body. In parallel, Julia started a light medication for her migraines and to help with anxiety. The pediatrician and the psychologist worked together, monitoring her closely. Within 2 weeks, the physical symptoms began to subside. The headaches became less frequent. The dizziness stopped. The weakness in her legs disappeared. Julia's body, finally relieved of its emotional weight, began to function normally again. But the real healing was happening in the sessions with Dr. Mendez. Julia learned to talk about her fears. She learned that it was okay to have difficult feelings. She learned techniques for when anxiety returned, breathing, mindfulness, ways to calm her mind, and most importantly, she learned that she didn't have to be strong all the time, that it was okay to be vulnerable, that asking for help wasn't failing. Megan and Ryan also participated in some family therapy sessions. It was hard for both of them to realize that, unintentionally, they had put Julia in a position she shouldn't have been in. Megan recognized that in her most desperate moments, she had leaned too heavily on her daughter, drawing strength from her faith when she should have been protecting her from the brutal reality. Ryan admitted that, without realizing it, he had made Julia his main anchor, and that was too heavy a burden for a child to carry. Dr. Mendez helped them understand that they hadn't done any of this out of malice. They were surviving a crisis, doing the best they could under the circumstances. But now, with the crisis over, it was time to reorganize, to remember that Julia was a child, and she needed to be allowed to be a child again. Celia, who participated in one of the sessions, offered a grandmother's wisdom. Children are stronger than we think, but even the strongest need solid ground beneath their feet. We, the adults, are that ground. We can't ask them to hold us up. Anthony, who was also invited to a session, shared his own guilt. He recognized that he had failed to be that solid ground for Ryan when he was a child, and that perhaps, unconsciously, he was trying to compensate by taking care of Julia now. Dr. Mendez helped him see that this was natural, but that the important thing was to be present in the right way, not as someone in debt, but as someone who simply loves. The weeks of April and May were a time of emotional healing for the whole family. Julia started playing with her friends again, without the constant tension she had carried. She began to take an interest in kid things again, cartoons, games, silly conversations. Megan learned to take better care of herself, not to overextend, to accept help when it was offered. Ryan continued his physical recovery, but also worked on his emotional recovery, dealing with the guilt of having been the unintentional cause of so much of his family's suffering. It was in early June, as the 1-year anniversary of the accident approached, that Julia had an idea. She had saved, throughout that entire period, photos, drawings, notes, records of every important moment of their journey. She had pictures of the poster she had made, marking her father's achievements. She had drawings she had given him in the hospital. She had notes she had written. She even had some photos that nurses and therapists had taken at significant moments. Julia decided she wanted to turn it all into a scrapbook, a complete record of the journey they had taken as a family. Not just of the suffering, but mainly of the victories, of how they had faced the impossible and won together. Megan helped her. They bought a large scrapbook with thick pages. For 2 weeks, Julia organized everything chronologically. She put in photos from the hospital, from the rehabilitation period, of her father's first steps, of the day he went back to work. She wrote captions for each photo. She glued in the drawings. She transcribed excerpts from the journal she had kept. It was a project that took up all her afternoons, but she was determined to finish it before the 1-year anniversary. On the last day of working on the scrapbook, Julia wrote a message on the back cover. She didn't show it to anyone, saying it was a surprise. Megan respected that, but she saw that her daughter was crying as she wrote, and crying now, after so much therapy, was no longer a cause for concern. It was just emotion, human and healthy. The The one-year anniversary of the accident fell on a Tuesday, June 23rd. The family had discussed whether they should mark the date, and they decided they should. Not as a day of mourning, but as a celebration of having walked through the darkest valley and emerged on the other side, together and whole. Celia prepared a special lunch. Anthony brought a cake he had ordered from a bakery. They invited Lucy, the nurse who had been so important during the hospital days. They invited Fernanda, the physical therapist. They invited Dr. Allen, who had initiated the stimulation protocol. They invited Dr. Mendez, who had helped Julia heal emotionally. It was a small celebration, but full of meaning. When everyone was gathered in the living room, Julia asked for their attention. She was nervous, Megan could see that, but she was also determined. The girl went to her room and came back with the scrapbook wrapped in colorful paper. She handed it to Ryan. Ryan opened it slowly, as if afraid the contents would disappear if he wasn't careful. When he saw the first page, he began to cry. It was a photo of him at the construction site, taken just days before the accident. He was smiling, his yellow hard hat on, the bright March sun lighting up his face. Underneath, Julia had written, "Before, when life was simple." The following pages told the whole story. The accident through drawings Julia had made. The hospital, with candid photos she had asked people to take. The coma, represented by a series of notes she had left on her father's bedside table, all saying, "Come back to me." The stimulation protocol, with photos of Julia talking to her unconscious father. The awakening, with a blurry photo Megan had taken the moment Ryan opened his eyes for the first time. Then came the photos of rehabilitation, Ryan on the parallel bars, his face contorted with effort. Ryan taking his first steps alone. Ryan climbing the stairs. Ryan walking into the company office on his first day back at work. Every achievement documented, every moment of victory preserved. But it wasn't just about Ryan. There were photos of Megan, exhausted but determined, sleeping in a chair next to his bed. There were photos of Celia, making food in the hospital kitchen to make sure the family ate. There was a photo of Anthony sitting in the waiting room, his head in his hands, an image of regret and hope mixed together. There were photos of Lucy, always present, always caring, of Fernanda, pushing Ryan beyond what he thought he could do, and there were photos of Julia talking to her dad in the hospital, Julia showing off the achievement poster, Julia hugging her dad when he woke up, Julia by his side in physical therapy, Julia holding his hand as he took his first steps. Her journey was documented too. Ryan turned the pages slowly, crying without stopping. Megan cried beside him. Celia dried her eyes with her apron. Anthony had moved to a corner, too emotional to speak. The guests watched in respectful silence. On the last page of the scrapbook, there was a recent photo of the whole family gathered in Celia's backyard. Ryan, Megan, Julia, Celia, Anthony, all smiling, arms intertwined. Underneath, Julia had written a message. "After, we won together. I learned that we don't need miracles when we have love. I learned that family isn't about being perfect. It's about not giving up. I learned that a dad can fall and a daughter can help him up. And that doesn't mean the daughter had to be too strong. It just means we love each other. Thank you for coming back. Thank you for teaching me that we will always fight for each other, because families like this don't just face the impossible, they win." Ryan read those words and couldn't hold back anymore. He pulled Julia into a tight hug, and Megan joined them. Soon after, Celia and even Anthony were in the embrace. It was a moment of catharsis, of release, of acknowledging everything they had been through and everything they had achieved. When they finally separated, Ryan looked at each person in that room. Lucy, who had cared for him when he was just another patient. Dr. Allen, who had believed it was worth trying when others had given up. Fernanda, who had pushed his body beyond its limits to bring him back. Dr. Mendez, who had healed his daughter from the invisible wounds the crisis had left. And his family. Megan, who had been his rock when he was lost. Julia, who had been his light in the darkness. Celia, who had offered a home when they had nowhere to go. And Anthony, who had turned regret into redemption. Ryan wiped his eyes and spoke, his voice still choked but firm. "I died on that construction site. My heart stopped. I was leaving, and you all brought me back. I don't know if it was medicine or a miracle or just your stubbornness in not letting me go. It was probably all of it. But I know one thing. I didn't survive alone. And it wasn't just my body that was saved. It was my soul, my family, my future. You gave me a second chance, and I promise I will use every day of this second chance to honor what you did for me." Megan took his hand. "We didn't do it alone either. We all saved each other. We held each other up. And that's what got us here," Julia then added with the wisdom she had gained through suffering and healing. "And we'll keep holding each other up, because that's what families do. No matter what comes, we'll face it together." Anthony, who had been quiet until then, finally spoke. He looked at Ryan. "I lost 12 years of your life. I can't get that time back, but I can be present from now on, if you'll let me." Ryan looked at his father. There were still remnants of hurt. There probably always would be. But there was also forgiveness and understanding that people are complex, that they make mistakes, but that they can change. "I'll let you. Because family isn't about the past. It's about the present and the future we build together." Celia, always the silent but strong matriarch, looked at everyone and said, "This house was too big and too empty before you all came. Now it's a home, and a home isn't measured in square feet. It's measured in love, in presence, in moments like this." The lunch that followed was joyful. They talked, laughed, reminisced about moments from the journey that now, with distance, could be revisited without so much pain. Lucy told funny stories from the hospital. Fernanda shared secrets about how she really thought Ryan wouldn't walk again, but never let him see it. Dr. Allen talked about the paper he had published on the case, which was generating interest in the medical community about the role of emotional support in neurological recovery. Dr. Mendez praised Julia for her courage in seeking help and doing the hard work of emotional healing. In the afternoon, after the guests had left, the family gathered in the living room. The scrapbook lay open on the coffee table, open to the last page, to the photo of them all together. Julia was lying on the sofa, her head in Megan's lap, her feet in her father's. Celia was crocheting in an armchair, the rhythmic movement of the needles creating its own melody. Anthony was playing dominoes by himself at the dining table, a quiet and welcome presence. Ryan looked around and felt a deep gratitude. Not just gratitude for being alive, but gratitude for the journey. Because the journey had transformed them all, it had revealed strengths they didn't know they had. It had united the family in ways that normal life never would have. It had brought Anthony back. It had shown Julia that she was stronger than she imagined, but that it was also okay to be vulnerable. It had proven to Megan that she was capable of enduring the unendurable and still emerging whole on the other side. It had taught them all that miracles aren't magical events that happen without effort, but the result of hard work, unwavering faith, and an absolute refusal to give up. Julia, half asleep in her mother's lap, murmured, "Dad, can I ask you something?" Ryan stroked her feet. "Of course, sweetheart. Do you remember anything from when you were in the coma? From when I talked to you?" Ryan was silent for a moment. It was a question he had avoided answering until now, because the truth was complex. "I don't remember specific words. I don't remember conversations. But I remember feelings, warmth, safety, knowing, even without knowing, that I wasn't alone. It was like being in a very dark, very cold place, but feeling a thin thread of light and warmth pulling me back. I think that thread was you." Julia smiled, satisfied. "So it worked. I knew it." Megan kissed the top of her daughter's head. "It always worked, my love. It always worked." That night, after Julia had gone to sleep and the house was quiet, Ryan and Megan stood on the front porch. The air was cool, the sky full of stars. Ryan, who could now stand for long periods without fatigue, stood there, leaning on the porch railing, looking out at the quiet street. Megan came and stood beside him. "What are you thinking about?" Ryan sighed. "About how everything changed. A year ago, I was climbing up on that construction site, thinking about how we only needed 6 more months to have enough for a down payment on a house, thinking about how I was going to throw you a surprise party for your birthday, thinking about normal, everyday things. And then everything changed in a second. Megan nodded. It changed. But not just for the worse. Ryan looked at her, surprised. Not just for the worse? Megan chose her words carefully. Obviously, I would give anything for that accident to have never happened, for you not to have suffered, for Julia not to have carried that weight, for me not to have lived through those months of terror. But it did happen, and we got through it. And in the process, we discovered things. We discovered we're stronger than we thought. We discovered there are people who care more than we imagined. It brought your father back. It taught Julia lessons about resilience and asking for help that will serve her for her whole life. It taught us not to take anything for granted. Ryan took her hand. Are you saying it was worth it? Megan shook her head quickly. No, I'm not saying that. But I'm saying we turned a tragedy into something that also had beauty, because we chose to do that. We could have given up. We could have fallen apart, but we chose to fight. And I'm grateful to have you here, even if you're different than you were, even if the journey was the hardest of our lives. Ryan hugged her. I'm grateful too, for you, for Julia, for everyone. And I promise I'm going to appreciate every day I was given back. They stood there for a while longer, holding each other under the stars, 2 survivors, of a storm that had nearly destroyed them, but in the end had only revealed how unbreakable they were when they were together. The following week, Ryan and Megan started looking for a house, not a big or luxurious house, but something that was theirs. With the financial help Anthony had given from the sale of his apartment, plus the money they had started saving again since Ryan went back to work, plus a small bank loan, they could do it. It wouldn't be the house with the big backyard they had originally dreamed of. It would be smaller, simpler, but it would be theirs. Julia, when she found out, was excited. She had loved living with her grandma Celia, but the idea of having a house that was just for her family was thrilling. She started making plans for her room, what color they would paint the walls, where they would put the scrapbook she had made. They found a house in August in the Northfield neighborhood, not far from Celia's house. It was a single-story home, as it needed to be because of Ryan's physical limitations, with 2 bedrooms, a small living room, a kitchen, and a tiny backyard that could barely fit a grill, but was perfect for them. It needed some work, but nothing they couldn't do over time. The move happened in September. It was a joyful and chaotic process. Anthony helped with everything, carrying boxes, assembling furniture. Celia brought over things from her house that she knew the family would need. New neighbors, having heard their story from the local paper months ago, showed up to help. On the first day in the new house, after everything was minimally organized, the family sat on the floor of the empty living room. Julia looked around, with a huge smile. It's small, but it's ours, Ryan laughed. It's perfect because it's ours. Megan agreed. We're going to make a lot of memories here. And they did. In the months that followed, that small house in Northfield filled with life, with laughter, with family dinners, with silly arguments about whose turn it was to do the dishes, with movie nights in the living room, with afternoons of Julia doing homework at the kitchen table while Ryan helped her with math. Normal, everyday life, precious precisely because of its normalcy. Julia continued with therapy, but now less frequently. Dr. Mendez said she had done excellent work and was ready to move on, knowing that if she ever needed to, she could always come back. The girl had matured throughout the process. She hadn't lost her ability to be a child, but she had gained an emotional depth rare for her age. She knew how to talk about her feelings. She knew how to ask for help. She knew how to recognize when she was taking on too much. These were tools that would serve her for the rest of her life. Ryan continued at the construction company, proving every day that he had value beyond his physical strength. Mr. Miller often said that bringing him into the office was one of the best decisions he had ever made. Ryan had a unique perspective. He understood the workers because he had been one. He understood the sites because he had lived on them. He was a valuable bridge between management and the field. Megan, with their finances finally more stable, was able to reduce her hours at the grocery store and started a technical course in accounting. It was an old dream she had shelved when Julia was born. Now, with life more organized, it was time to reclaim her own dreams too. Anthony bought a simple little house near the family. Nothing big, but it was his. And every Friday, he had dinner with Ryan, Megan, and Julia. The relationship between father and son would never be without scars. There were moments when old hurts resurfaced, but there were also moments of genuine connection, of shared laughter, of comfortable silences. They were building a new relationship, not trying to recover the old one. And maybe that was even better. Celia, with her house empty again but her heart full, resumed her activities at church, in her seniors group, in her craft classes. But she always reserved Sundays for lunch with the family at the new house. They were loud, happy lunches, full of good food and even better company. And so life went on. Not perfect, because life is never perfect. There were bills to pay, hard days, small arguments, common worries, but there was also love, presence, gratitude for each ordinary, precious day. 2 years after the accident on a Tuesday morning, Ryan woke up early. Megan was still asleep beside him, Julia still in her bed. He got up, went out to the small backyard and breathed in the cool morning air. His movements were still a bit slower than before the accident, and they probably always would be. But they worked. He worked. He was alive, whole, present. Ryan thought about everything that had happened, the accident that nearly killed him, the months lost in a coma, the brutal fight of recovery, the near loss of his daughter to a different kind of trauma, the unlikely reconciliation with his father, the discovery of a community that cared, the lessons about strength, faith, family, and he realized something fundamental. He hadn't returned to the same life he had before. He had returned to a new life, built on the ashes of the old one. And this new life, with all its imperfections and scars, was richer, deeper, more meaningful. Ryan looked at the sky that was beginning to lighten, the first rays of dawn tinting the clouds pink and gold, and whispered a prayer of gratitude. Not for not having died on that construction site, though he was grateful for that too, but for everything that came after, for the journey his family had taken, for the people they had met along the way, for the lessons they had learned, because in the end perhaps the greatest lesson of all was this: life isn't measured by the perfect moments, but by how we respond to the imperfect ones. It's not measured by never falling, but by how many times we get back up. It's not measured by never feeling fear, but by having courage in spite of it. And it's not measured by being alone, but by building a network of love strong enough to catch us when we fall. Ryan went back inside, lay down again next to Megan, who snuggled against him, still asleep. In a few hours, Julia would wake up, run to the kitchen, already talking a mile a minute, as she always did. They would have breakfast together. He would go to work, Megan to her class, Julia to school, another ordinary, everyday, absolutely precious day. And at the end of that day, when they all gathered at home again, they would share the small victories and daily frustrations, because that's what families did. Not just in moments of crisis, but especially in the ordinary moments. They stuck together. They held each other up. They loved each other. Because families like this, who have faced the impossible and won, know that it's not just about surviving the storms. It's about learning to dance in the rain. It's about turning scars into strength. It's about building something beautiful from the ruins. It's about never ever giving up on each other. We will always fight for each other. That phrase Julia had said that day, a year ago, had become the family's mantra. It wasn't just a nice saying, it was a promise, a choice renewed every day, a truth tested by fire and proven unbreakable. The sun rose completely, illuminating the small house in Northfield. Inside, a family slept, rested, prepared for another day. A family that had looked into the abyss and decided to come back. That had faced the impossible and had won. Not because they were special or had superpowers, but because they had each other. And in the end, that was the only miracle that truly mattered.